You're listening to Represent, the Queer Musical Theatre podcast. My name is Dr James Lovelock, and I'm an academic and a huge musical theatre fan, exploring the representation of all things queer in the musical theatre industry. My guests today are the extraordinary writer Chris Bush and the fabulous actor and workshop queen Beth Hinton-Lever. Beth recently appeared in Chris's play Otherland at the Almeida Theatre, which follows the post-breakup relationship between Harry, who has recently come out as a trans woman, and Jo, who is preparing to be a mother. We talk about trans, queer and disability representation, as well as exploring Chris's beautiful musical Standing at the Sky's Edge, Beth's West End debut in Hadestown, and an epic community musical called the Doncastrian Chalk Circle. As always, you can follow us on your favourite podcast platform, and don't forget to share this episode on social media. Let's get started.
Hello, my name is Beth Hinton-Lever. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an actor. And I think I'm here because I'm also queer and I have a lot of opinions.
Hooray! That's what we need on a podcast. Lovely. And Chris?
Hi, yes, I'm Chris Bush, she, her. I am a playwright, lyricist, theatre maker, sometime screenwriter a little bit occasionally, promoter of queerness across all art forms.
Excellent stuff. So what we're trying to do on this series of the podcast is we're looking a little bit at what it means, what the term queer gain means. So what do we gain from queer people being involved in art and particularly in musical theatre? So I was going to start off today thinking a little bit about maybe some of the projects that you've done, maybe a favourite project that you've done that you feel is something that you've really connected to as an actor or as a writer.
I mean, I feel like the last project that we have both done, working together, Otherland at the Almeida, was a really special one for me and came at the end of around 7 or 8 years of trying to get that show on, which was the third theatre that had been in development with. Very, very thankful to the Almeida for taking a chance on it, really, and just saying yes and actually get it programmed after a very kind of long slog to get that far. Which I think was, very, very special, quite kind of close to my heart and quite a personal story in lots of ways. But also, I think one of the reasons why it took 7 or 8 years to get on was I was striving for a version of queer authenticity, I suppose, that some other theatres maybe weren't as interested in and liked on paper, but then had their own idea of what that story should be and what kind of familiar, slightly tropey beats that would have to hit along the way in order to sort of be understandable to an audience, and actually sticking to my guns and finding the right partner in the Almeida. We were able to sort of come to the end of a very long road. Unfortunately, we did then put Beth in it, but I'm saying the tone early because I feel like most of our friendship is us just being mean to each other. And I feel like it would be really inauthentic to come in here and pretend that's not what we do.
Chris also used me for, I think, every single workshop, I should say. We do love each other. But
you were there from the only actor I think who did every workshop.
Yeah,
was there
she can't get rid of me yet.
No.
But I agree. I think Otherland was an incredibly special piece to also watch for so many years, kind of change and as Chris said, she always stuck to her guns with the way in which queerness is represented. And I was incredibly proud to be on that stage with those incredible women and all the women and the people that also helped us make it. And it felt like the Almeida as well made it a incredibly kind of safe space. And I mean that not in the sense of kind of stifling any articulation that might be there, as in it just felt we could all try and be ourselves and fail and come back from it in a place where it was just held. And I think that was really important, and to be in that room was really special.
It's been really difficult, hasn't it? Because that phrase "safe space" is so important for us as queer people, but it's kind of got a bit of it's been kind of taken away from us and given this really sort of mollycoddling feel about
exactly.
it. And that's not what we mean at all when we're talking about.
No, it wasn't
spaces.
just, a poster on a wall. It was an actual feeling of safety in that room.
And that enables people to do their best work, right? You know, that knowing that there's an implicit sense of like trust and people, you know, have everyone's back, and therefore, you know, you get an openness, you get a playfulness maybe, and an experimentation in the room that, yeah, if you're having to second guess yourself in any sort of as a performer or a writer or as anything, then you're never going to be making your best work. And I think also shout out to Anne Yee, our incredible director in that, and get you who, because you don't want to get too sort of tokenistic about sort of who are the right people for the team, and fundamentally Anne is just the best theatre director out there and she's extraordinary, but also to have a queer woman helming that team does feel like, again, lots of things are implicitly held. You are actually starting that journey from a relatively high level of understanding. Interesting, actually, when we were in the room and we were talking about particularly, you know, queerness in general, but more specifically in terms of trans identities, and sort of going, actually, we need to remember that within this group of people, you know, 8 actors and, you know, however many creatives or whatever, we're sort of starting 12 steps ahead of the general discourse on like gender identity, for instance. So actually going like, we need to remember that our audience might always be with where we are, and how are we going to like enable making work that's going to like carry an audience with us in a way that feels not, again, like not mollycoddling, not sort of but enables people to end up in a place of greater understanding, which I think is the, you know, the goal of that piece, certainly.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I'm sure we all got amazed. Like, the reaction was incredible to Otherland, and it's an incredibly important play, and it's a beautiful play. And I think some of my favourite interactions were the audience who came up to us and kind of said, "Thank you, because I now understand my grandson." And it's like, oh, so we knew what it meant to us as kind of queer people in the team doing the show, and, you know, but what was amazing was to know that understanding and that love and care was extended into an audience that I think it's fair to say at the Almeida you're looking at a certain demographic, and yeah, it was so special, so special.
I absolutely loved it. It's one of my favourite things that I've seen for a very long time. And I guess as somebody in the queer community, but not necessarily somebody that has a detailed knowledge or lived experience of female queer relationships or trans relationships, I just thought it was such a wonderful piece just to be thrust into the middle of this piece, you know? And I feel like that's the sort of work I'm looking for, and that's the sort of work I want to champion. And I hope that we have more of that, becomes more accessible to people. I think one of the questions that I'm kind of struggling with at the moment is, so Otherland was great and it was fantastic, and it was at the Almeida Theatre and lots of people went to see it. But how do we get that play now to other people who might need to see it? What happens next? And I think that's the question I have with a lot of the work, a lot of the queer work that we see at the moment, because it tends to be on quite limited runs. And so I don't know whether there's any answers to that question or not, or you have any thoughts about how we kind of share, I mean, particularly Chris, you know, how we share your work, you know, without infringing copyright. But
yeah, I think it's really hard. And, you know, I was so delighted with that production. Genuinely couldn't have asked for a better team of people other than Beth. Genuinely, like, so proud of it. And, you know, it was a piece that broadly was really sort of critically well received, played to, you know, more or less full house for its entire run. But then, yeah, you know, you run for 5 weeks and it's quite a big cast for new writing. You know, we had a cast of 8 and a band of 3. And yeah, you know, I don't think it is going to have an immediate future life in the UK. At least I'm still like banging on a lot of doors in New York, and I feel like it could play there, and I've not given up on that yet. But it's, you know, it's true across the industry that, you know, if you've got a new piece that doesn't have, you know, real household names leading TV series in it, it's very hard to get that future commercial life for it. And if you then add on top of that an element of, you know, whether it's queerness, whether it's whatever sort of protected identity or angle that might make it seem less mainstream. And I suppose particularly with something like Otherland, it takes some sort of big theatrical swings as well. You know, it doesn't contain itself within naturalism. It doesn't sort of, I think it is accessible and it's an entertaining night out. It's not, you know, it's not hard work, but actually on paper it can maybe seem like a bit of a tough sell. And so it's interesting, I suppose, to look at those examples of queerness. I know I say this and it might sound like it's pejorative, and it really, I don't mean it to be. If you take a show like Everybody's Talking About Jamie, for instance, which came out of Crucible, where Sky's Edge did as well, and, you know, has produced so many incredible shows, and, you know, really track record for new musical theatre. And one of the interesting things about Jamie, which again is such a fun night out, is that actually it's, I think, incredibly mainstream and accessible in its representations of queerness, which enables it to go to the West End, to, you know, tour both nationally and internationally, to sort of reach that audience, because it has a kind of, if you like, non-threatening gloss to it. And I think you will see in all forms, but particularly in queer art, the slightly more out there, on the fringes stuff, the stuff that is able to speak more to a mainstream. Neither one is more important than the other. Actually, they're both really necessary, I think, in terms of a broader ecology of queer identities, queer storylines. And then I suppose to go on to something like Sky's Edge, for instance, which, again, you know, when I first came on board to that project, I wasn't necessarily expecting it to be a show that was going to, you know, transfer to the National, transfer to the West End, do the sort of journey that it did. But again, it feels like the hook of that was, here is a slice of social history. Here is the story of post-war Britain within this broadly working class community in Sheffield. And that was certainly the sell of it in Sheffield, at least anyway. And then it sort of became something a bit more expansive as it grew. I think there's a danger when you're talking about sort of northern storylines and working class storylines. Firstly, the danger that those two things mean the same thing, which clearly that they don't, but also that those representations become sort of monolithically straight and white, essentially. And I always knew that wasn't going to be the story that I was going to tell. And it was the sort of the primary reason of my initiative going, I want these 3 storylines and follow these 3 different families, was to get a sort of breadth of storytelling possibility. So you're not just following, you know, if we were just stuck with Harry and Rose in 1960 and a direct line of their descendants of, again, white working class Sheffielders, nothing wrong with that story, fascinating, but doesn't speak to the truth of the city. And actually going, you know, there needs to be racial diversity within that company. I knew that I wanted a queer relationship at the heart of that story, and it feels a little bit queerness by stealth in a way. You're not selling that story, I think, as a queer musical, but it is, and it's not just through Bobby and Nikki, who are that central queer couple, but there's lots of sort of queerness threaded through in other spaces as well, and in other ways. But also they are just quote unquote normal people who have their sort of dilemmas isn't being driven by a sense of, you know, of queer identity. That's not what's throwing them into crisis, or that's not what's propelling them forward. That just happens to be who they are, which I think is also a really important part of queer storytelling, as well as those stories which is about, no, you actually need to understand what it means to be othered in this way, what it means to be a queer person, a trans person, you know, whatever that might be. But yeah, so I think there's space for all of it, basically. But it's interesting to see which stories can have that commercial life and which stories is a much harder sell.
If you're interested in LGBTQ plus representation in musical theatre, check out our website www.queermusicals.com for lots more information about musicals with LGBTQ plus characters. One of the things I love about you, Beth, is that every time I see something about you on social media, you're workshopping something. And I feel like you are the workshop queen. And
thank you.
And I also love that the stuff that you workshop very often has certainly themes of otherness, but often has themes of queerness as well. Yeah. And I think one of the things, kind of on the same theme, but one of the things I'm thinking about is, how do we take some of these shows that are in workshop stages, how do we get them to the next stage? And I guess maybe a better question is, are there shows that you've workshopped that you love that you're kind of waiting to see what happens to next?
Ooh, yeah, definitely. I mean, as you say, I love a workshop. I think it's an incredibly exciting period of time for any production, and to get to go in as an actor and have a hand in kind of, I guess, like the narrative and the voice of that character and like the way that they fit into the world. And I mean, I've said this before, but every role I ever play, in my opinion, is queer and disabled, because I can't splice those two things away from me. That's so intrinsically in the essence of who I am that I carry that into these roles. Yeah. So I think when I am workshopping, without meaning to, even if it's not explicitly a pansexual character, they all end up being that way.
Yeah.
So I think one of my favourite shows I've ever workshopped was actually the show that Chris and I met on, which was a retelling of the Caucasian Chalk Circle, which became the Doncastrian Chalk Circle. It was part of the public acts programme at the National Theatre, which is an incredible programme, and I love it dearly and have worked with them before, so I got asked to come in and do this workshop. And I was playing Safia Chichava, so the kind of queering of Simon. And I read the Caucasian Chalk Circle. I did, I think it must have been at GCSE level. And I remember not really caring about this masculine soldier that seemingly leaves his girlfriend and like wasn't really interested in her, was more interested in like this goose, is what I remember from Simon. And then to kind of read this incredible version of it, which was also a musical, and just from the virtue that Safia was then in a queer relationship with Grusha, and the fact that there was a child there, and Safia loved that child as if it was her own. And I think there was something so beautiful about this epic love story that spanned decades and years, and they waited for each other and they yearned for each other. And, you know, she protected Grusha and she thought of her. And yeah, I think there was something so special about the epicness of it that I think, especially in like old stories, we don't really find for queer characters. And yeah, I thought that was amazing, to the point where we finished that workshop and I think we did a sharing, and I went up to Chris and James Blakey, the director, and just went, "You're not auditioning anyone else for this role, I'm playing it." And somehow that worked.
Well done, Beth.
And it was amazing. And I think one of my favourite things about Public Acts as a programme as well is there are 5 professional actors and then, I'm going to say, over 100 community members that all come and fill out this beautiful company and this cast. And from all ages, I think from the youngest is usually about 4, which is amazing, and then up to, 100, however old. And to get to portray a gay relationship where we had, no one questioned why they're gay, why is she a woman? They just went, yeah, but that's who they are, and they loved them and they really adored them. And I think me and my Grusha Daisy, we kissed, and we were a bit like, the first time we did it, we were like, oh, okay, what are this community going to think? Are we going to get some awkward questions? We got a massive round of applause and a cheer. Like, I just think there's something so special about taking some of these stories that we think we know and changing them to become this kind of queer relationship, and what that can do and what that can mean and what it can show that community. And it was amazing. It was absolutely incredible to do that, and that's probably one of my favourite, if not my favourite shows I've ever done. I also started my career in Doncaster, so it felt like a really nice homecoming to go back there. And the last show I did there before Doncastrian Chalk Circle was a pantomime where, again, it was a queer relationship. So it just felt very, incredible. And then when we had community members coming up to me and saying, I think I might be queer. And as a queer actor, I got to then kind of actually have like something to hold their hand and say, oh, okay, well, I remember when I came out, or this is what I told my mum. And that was incredible from virtue of kind of casting a queer person in a queer role. So You know, it was just such a special thing. And obviously I met Chris, which is up and down, but what can we do?
Yeah, because again, I think there's such a presumption that like queerness only exists, or at least can only be like celebrated and open in, you know, London, maybe Brighton, maybe Manchester at a push, and that, somewhere like Doncaster, can you really have a queer relationship? Whatever, like, of course you fucking can. Like, why would this be? But actually, that kind of visible representation on stage, you know, that feels like it is a significant thing. And again, I sort of, in terms of how you get those queer narratives into a mainstream as well, as I feel like the phrase in my head is queerness by stealth, which feels like deeply problematic. But
I also want it tattooed on my body. It's amazing.
But is of, you know, taking a classic story and finding that as your sort of angle into it, you know. And the, you know, the Caucasian Chalk Circle is 10-second summary. A poor woman working in the kitchens finds this child that's been abandoned by a rich family who are fleeing in midst of revolution, raises it as her own, and then the birth mother comes back, and there's a big trial about who gets to raise this child, who will provide the best home for it. Is it the person who's been raising this child or the person who's biologically connected to it? Which feels like such a sort of open goal to tell a story about chosen family, about queer family, and actually by making that central relationship, by going like, you know, you are not my blood but you are still mine, and to sort of find those sort of, you know, transgressive conversations about belonging, about your tribe, about who are the people who have your back, and sort of, which feels like it was so in the spirit of absolutely everything that I believe Brecht is standing for, in terms of the centre of a community, in terms of, you know, the garden belongs to the ones who will tend it, this idea of, you know, what it means when a community sort of comes together. Even though we were taking some sort of quite wild swings, I suppose, in terms of changing plot points, and actually the Brecht estate were really great. I thought they were going to be a lot more sort of difficult to navigate, you know, but actually they were really up for this story, even though we were changing quite a lot of plot, because I think absolutely it was in the spirit of it. We were not fundamentally trying to make that show anything that it isn't at its heart.
I think that's one of the things that people come back to quite a lot with musical theatre, is they say that because it's an adaptive medium, that's the reason, or that's the excuse for stories being maybe 30 or 40 years behind us. And particularly for queerness, obviously that's a really big deal. And so I'm thinking at the moment in the West End, I'm not sure that we have any musicals that have a queer protagonist at the moment. I think Why Am I So Single was probably the last show that was true of. And so it's great to hear about how you can reinvent stories, and particularly classic stories as well. And, you know, you talked about the Brecht estate there. One of the things I was really interested to find was that there was a gender-swapped queer version of Oklahoma that the Rodgers and Hammerstein Foundation allowed to happen at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival about 5 or 6 years ago. And I love that. I mean, it must have taken years to get the Rodgers and Hammerstein Foundation to that stage. But I think that there's something to be said about how you go about, you know, taking older stories and kind of sprinkling queerness among them. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I will shout out the fact that there is a show called After the Act currently at the Royal Court, which is brilliant. It's a new musical about Section 28. But again, that was made elsewhere and then has gone into the Royal Court. So I think it would be amazing if some of these big theatres and companies were, you know, creating them and putting them onto those stages. But it's a brilliant musical, and that is currently on. But again, for a really, really limited run.
Yes.
But yeah, sorry.
Well, no, I was going to say two things. One is that I don't know if that is the production, but I think the Oregon Oklahoma might have been worked on by Anne Yee, actually.
Wow.
Because I know that she did do a very queer Oklahoma somewhere in America, and I'm wondering how many of them that there would have been anyway, because I know that it wasn't the Daniel Fish one that, of course, came over here and did very well. Really interesting. And sort of heartbreaking if that's, you know, if that is the case, that there isn't a a musical currently in the West End with a queer protagonist, because we do think of theatre in general, but musical theatre in particular, as being such an innately queer medium. But actually, you sort of look at the codification of queerness in a way, and how everyone knows that this character has an essence of, or straying outside of musicals, but if there's a really, really beautiful section in After the Act, actually, when a character describes their sort of queer awakening, if you like, coming from a teacher breaking down the queerness that exists within Streetcar Named Desire and other Tennessee Williams works, and of sort of going yes, this is, this presented as cis straight woman is so coded as a queer man in this sort of way, and that's, and hopefully we're coming out of a point of the necessity for a codification or a disguising of queer narrative to make it more palatable, and queerness evolves. I think that's also a really interesting question about who queerness on stage is for, and whether you are seeking to make work that speaks broadly to your community, and it's about going this is one for us, this is going, I see you and you are valid human, and you can go and watch a reflection of yourself on stage and feel something really powerful, versus something that is primarily for an audience who is not that. Again, this applies to all sorts of whatever protected minority that might be, whether that's to do with queerness, whether that's to do with race, whether that's to do with class, of going is this one for us or is it one for them so we are better understood? And of course, the best work will do both of those things. And I would hope that a show like Otherland is able to do sort of both of those things in terms of show sort of authentic representation that somebody can see and go, yeah, that's me. But also someone, again, that can bring their mum to, can bring their grand to and go, this is me. Can you watch this, please?
If you want to follow us on social media, you can use queer.musicals on Instagram or Facebook. Or you can follow me at Dr James Lovelock on Instagram.
Interestingly, those, I suppose, totems of queerness as well, queer musical theatre, quite recently, so the wonderful Jackie Clune, who was also in Otherland, is currently, or has maybe just finished a stint as the narrator in the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh, wow.
And a bunch of us from the Otherland company all went out to watch this on tour. And I was struck by how this show that is such a queer icon, and rightly so in all sorts of ways, but feels like it is now playing to such a straight audience in a way that I felt kind of almost uncomfortable being there, because it feels like it's going for that hen party-esque crowd where it's the equivalent, and this is, again, maybe unfair to hen parties, and of course I'm making broad generalizations, but the hen party who go to the gay bar and it's all a bit going to watch the monkeys at the zoo, and it's, and going, oh, this is a performance of queerness for, not to bring a kind of a better case of understanding, in fact, but as a form of, I suppose, titillation. And I'm not sure how comfortable I feel about that. But then also it's, whatever lens do you as an individual bring to anything that you're experiencing, and you can't always ask a production to sort of cater to your thing, because also I was watching that show going, it is not the fault of Richard O'Brien or anyone responsible for the Rocky Horror Picture Show that Frankenfurter, this incredible creature, this queer alien transvestite from transsexual Transylvania, is now full of sort of tropes and signifiers that terrible prejudiced people apply to trans women in terms of, this sort of figure who towers a foot above anybody else on stage and is sort of broad-shouldered and has 5 o'clock shadow, but is wearing this sort of high femme get-up and heels and is over-sexualized and is aggressively sexual and is deviant and is blah, 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 blah. Like, the Rocky Horror Show makes no claim, and never has done and never will be, that this is a representation of trans women. Absolutely not. And yet, is there a degree of, like, uncomfortableness of going and, like, experience that? Maybe there is for some people, but that's not the fault of the show. That's, I guess, that's just art, baby. That's what we're all here sort of wrestling with. But I think the sort of, again, and you can't pick your audience, and whoever buys a ticket is very welcome to come through the door and watch a show, but it's interesting how you interpret those sort of things, because again, at the moment, to me anyway, Rocky Horror on stage no longer feels like this subversive queer underground thing. It feels like this, a performance of something that doesn't feel like it's, authentic or healing or helping in a way. I mean, which again, like, I've got no objection to queer theatre being like a fun night out. Not everything needs to be a tutorial. That's not what I'm saying,
I think you're right there, and I think with Rocky Horror Show as well, because I think it was 1973 it first came out, or somewhere around that time. So it's 50 years old now, and it's not. I think there is a case sometimes for looking at work that's still going around. I mean, Rocky Horror Show is one example. There's so many examples of musicals that still go around on tour, and you think, I'm not sure how helpful it is, this musical. I'm thinking things like The King and I, which seems to still go round and round despite the obvious problematic tropes that are in that as well. It also kind of leads me to this other thing I've been thinking about, which goes back to the thing you're saying about who are we making these musicals for, this art for, and thinking about, well, maybe the West End or Broadway or whatever it is not where our musicals or these musicals necessarily need to be. But then the question becomes, how do we get the people who need to see these shows to be able to know where they are and find them? And
I remember we had a conversation about that with Otherland, because we were saying it felt like we were in some ways preaching to the choir, talking to our friends, which was incredible. And those shows they should be able to hold the community and invite them in. But it was one of those, okay, but the people that maybe would learn the most from it, how do you encourage them to buy a ticket? And then then there was also this, it's very unfortunate we had to have the conversation, but I think it's important that we did, because it's about safety, about if there were protesters who came to come see the show, how would we deal with that? How would we keep members of our company and our team safe? Or, how can we look after each other in that way? And I think that's also, I guess, I mean, I'm not a producer, and my goodness, I never should be. But if, you were going to do big gay play and put it on like Broadway or the West End, whether that's even something that would cross those producers' minds of the safety of the company, which I think this is a very off-tandem thought I've had. But I was trying to think of the last time, as a big West End company, we had to have a safety talk, and it was about the Just Stop Oil protesters, and about, if they stage invade, this is what you do. And then I was going, but we haven't had this safety conversation with any other, thing. And I don't know if that even would be a concern, but I don't know. I felt it was just an odd thing that in Otherland we were all so aware of it and so wanting to be able to look after each other that we had to have that conversation.
I think also it's we shouldn't be seeing the West End as the be all and end all, and not every show needs to end up there. And people also need queer that they can afford to see, and they need it where they are. I mean, one of the best examples I've seen is my partner, who's a writer and also a stage manager, worked on a Pentabus production of a Charlie Josephine show called One of Them Ones. Really brilliant play about two brothers, one cis, one trans, sort of trying to find a better understanding between the two of them in like broad strokes, while doing this like classically masculine thing of like one of them's a painter and decorator, and they're sort of they paint this room over the course of the show by was it's this sort of brilliant conceit of like, I'm talking to you about something difficult, so I can't make eye contact with you, so I'm going to go and paint this wall anyway. Great show.
It was brilliant.
And Charlie Josephine's brilliant. And it's Pentibus, so it did come in for a run at Brixton House, so it had a little London stint, but they are a rural touring company and were, playing small sort of art centres, village halls, very, very small places, which in the sort of rural communities that don't have a arts council subsidized theatre within whatever, and so the stuff that goes on in the village hall, in the pop-up venue, in whatever it is broadly seen by everyone who has a vague interest in the arts, regardless of what it is. So whether you're seeing a new queer Charlie Josephine play, whether you're seeing Alan Ayckbourn, whether you're seeing a Shakespeare on bikes, whatever it might be. And actually, one of the great things about London is, in a way, is this ability to find your tribe. And you go, on any given night, I can go, if I'm in the mood for a royal court kind of show, I can go to the court. If I'm in the mood for a bush show, I can go to the bush show. Any one of these sort of things, you will be catered for, presuming you can afford to buy a ticket. But actually, I suppose in terms of like fostering connection between a community, of going like, no, we all come, and it's the like that magic thing that a theatre can sometimes do when it feels like going to church, going to temple, when you're sort of going, yeah, we all come and we see this thing. And this week we're seeing two brothers come to an understanding about who they are and their relationship with each other and their gender. And next week we're going to come for a murder mystery, and next week we're going to come for basket weaving, and we're going to and that feels like that should be the goal. And then, queerness becomes as normalized as anything else within this sort of thing, rather than going, oh, I should go and see the queer show in town. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think that's very fair, actually. And I think also that's something that's really strong about some of our regional theatres as well. I mean, we mentioned the Sheffield Crucible, the Sheffield theatres earlier on, and the fact that they've managed to, they've had, everybody's talking about Jamie, they've had Standing at the Sky's Edge, but they've also had recently they had a production of Streetcar Named Desire. But all of those things, like you say, people have got memberships to go and see everything at the theatre. I remember some time ago interviewing somebody at the Theatre Calgary in Canada who said exactly the same thing, that he tries to program as many different shows as he can because he knows that the audience will always be there for it. And that's really interesting, and perhaps something we don't think about. I mean, as academics, we maybe don't think about enough. I've recently been teaching in Sheffield, which has been great, and so Standing at the Sky's Edge has been fantastic because I look out of the window of the university and I see where the musical is set, and I think there's something about things which are so clearly set in a place that really help to link it to the community. I was going to ask you a little bit about some of the other characters in Standing at the Sky's Edge as well, because one of the things I loved about it, I loved that Poppy and Nikki, were so central in that, but I also loved the fact that there was Marcus and Marcus's partner, and then there was also, I think it was quite heavily implied that George as well.
Yes, yeah.
And to have all of those queer characters in this story that covered, so many decades, was just something so wonderful. And I wondered how you was that a conscious decision, or did they just kind of appear as you were writing them?
Yeah, I think I always knew that, if you like, one of those three core relationships was always, of the sort of the three timelines, was always going to be a queer one, and that felt important. And then I think things kind of organically evolved from that point, from going, oh, actually, it's quite nice to have this friendship between Poppy and Marcus and be able to essentially land the gag of, oh, each of them thinking that the other one might think it's a date, and how will they let the other one down because they're both raging homosexuals.
I loved that.
And then, you're branching it out to then that sort of New Year's scene where there are lots of other queer couples as well, because we hang out together. Who's going to be at your, it's not going to necessarily be an exclusively queer gathering, but you're going to finding your tribe, you're going to find this community. And it also felt significant, I suppose, to go it's not just the outsider, it's not Poppy from the metropolis of London bringing queerness up north, of going like, no, it exists here as well. And then again, and that it doesn't only exist in the sort of present day strand, which I think is why it feels important to sort of, again, it's very light touch, but to kind of drip that in with George as well, who talks about we don't see his partner, but sort of refers to a partner at the end. And actually, who knows whether it'll ever happen, because such is the whims of TV production. But in theory, we're making, there might be a TV show. It's so far from being greenlit, so I'm not, I think I'm allowed to say this because it's been like, people know that we're developing it. But we'll see. But if that does happen, then actually, it gives us the scope to dive into so many more of those characters' backstories, and actually, George's sort of sexual awakening, I suppose, or not awakening, but sort of being able to live more as himself as he gets more settled in the area is going to be something we're going to be able to explore far more in a series if we ever get to make it, which feels like an exciting thing as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the song "The Streets Are Ours," which is just "Tonight the Streets Are Ours," which is just a beautiful song anyway. And when you hear George sing it, and in a very strong, is it Liberian accent?
Yes, yeah.
And that means one thing, but then to go back when you realise that George is also queer, and to have that song as well, and for the song to mean something completely different, and to mean something entirely different to what it meant originally when Richard Cordy wrote it as well. I think that's one of the things I love most about Standing at the Sky's Edge, is how you use the songs that were completely different from the very beginning. I didn't even realise it was a jukebox musical until afterwards, which is I think is for all the people sometimes have problems with there being so many jukebox musicals. Actually, when you can write a really clever jukebox musical, then it gives you this room to make your own story around it, and that allows you then to get free from maybe the movie or the whatever it is that you're writing the story from. This series of Represent has been recorded at the Content is Queen studio in Somerset House. Content is Queen is a podcast agency and community made up of women, people of colour and LGBTQIA+ people who wish to connect, create and collaborate using audio and podcasting. For more information, go to contentisqueen.org. So thinking about musical theatre in the future and where we are in terms of musical theatre at the moment, what sort of shows or what sort of characters or stories would you like to see more of in musical theatre? I'm going to ask you, Beth.
Okay. I mean, I would, as we've kind of said the whole way through, I wish that there was more of a opportunity for those shows that are being developed at places like the Edinburgh Fringe, on university campuses, to, if you look at Operation Mincemeat, like one of the biggest commercial successes I think this country's come up with for a very, very long time. Those shows that have those queer characters and that queer love and relationships and just the actual reality of being alive and a human being in this world is that there are queers everywhere and we're wonderful. Having more of those stories to a point where, as you said, it's not, the gay show's here or there's a queer show in town. It's just, I'd want to see a kind of fabric of across the country, up and down, of just those relationships being there. Because I think you can't... having that relationship in a theatre and, it not always being about coming out and about, the hardships and the othering and, feeling insecure in that. But if we had that real joy and, happy relationships and, relationships with older people, because it seems that there's a real focus on young coming out stories, not just settled down living with my partner in the Lake District stories, I'd love to see that coming through. Would be incredible. And, I think moving away from, this is a male character or a female character.
Yes.
And moving into, let's see who comes in.
Yeah.
And then let's be, I think that's to do with the States as well, just kind of being more open to, actually, why couldn't Orpheus be a woman? And why couldn't Eurydice be a woman? Why couldn't that story be told this way if we just change a couple of keys?
Yes.
I love Hadestown. I'm using Hadestown as an example because I was in it, so
and
I'm
also
allowed.
Hadestown has done, particularly with the role of Hermes, that has been changed virtually every time it's been done. And
I'd love to see that kind of across the board with, will anyone who comes in can play anyone? And I think that would be exciting. And, there's a bit at the beginning of Act 2 where Hermes and Persephone share a bit of a flirtation, a bit of a kiss. And that's always just a little bit of a sprinkle of, ooh, maybe they're gay. I'm like, well, why can't we just say it? Why does it have to be a little like hint and a tantalizing, oh, this might be just, be proud and loud and say it. And I mean, with Mean Girls, there are queer characters in that. But again, I'd love to have seen them end happy. And I know it's a musical. I know we all want to get 2:20 and out. But, it would be amazing if just cut 1 minute from somewhere else and give them a love story at the end. I don't know. I just think I'd like to see just more of a active thought of the portrayal of queerness in musical theatre and not kind of it being there as a foil to the lead straight couple.
Yes.
I think would be nice.
Yeah, that sounds great. Chris, do you have any thoughts?
So many thoughts. I think it would be nice to get to a point where you can have queer-led musicals that aren't driven by a crisis over their queerness or their gender identity, or it's about the struggles and the pressure. I mean, it's drama, so it's all about conflict, right? So you need some struggles, but do they need to be defined by sexuality? I think, if you broadly, to make some great sweeping statements about the sort of history of queer theatre, of which I am not a scholar, but, I've seen enough of it, it sort of feels like you have this progression where, firstly, everything needs to be codified. So you can't have any queer characters at all. You can only have characters that can be sort of read with a queer lens if you know what you're looking for. Then, if you have queerness, the story has to be about struggle. Maybe it's about the AIDS crisis. Maybe it's about horrific, homophobic attacks, whatever it may or may not be. Then sort of people cheer up a little bit, and all these things kind of continue as well. But then you start to introduce your queer comedies, and then it's going, okay, it's, this is still a story that's absolutely driven by sexuality because it's about the dating life of gay men. But again, it's about the queerness is the sort of the USP of that production. And then you get to a point where, yes, as a supporting role, you can have a character who's just happens to be queer and it's not necessarily at the heart of their thing, but maybe they are the sassy sidekick. And also in all of those things that I've just laid out as well, 90% of those stories are cis white gay male stories of queerness. So again, it's one part of a lens. And so sort of again, that story, and we would sort of joke about it in the Otherland rehearsal rooms of going we're not doing the sad man puts on lipstick version of trans representation, which is the only fucking story that you ever get, and people really need to stop doing it because it's so exhausting and just generally bad, and anyone who does it should be ashamed. And, but of how much of trauma dumping do we need to get through, and then we'll have the trans rom-com, and then we'll just have the this character can be trans and maybe that's fine, and then maybe they can lead a show. I'd like to get to that point where because it's a facet of and it does have an impact on your life, in a way that any aspect of your identity does. I have certain issues with I think what we sometimes refer to as colorblind casting in terms of race, or this sort of idea that actually you could gender flip a character from a canonical text, from a Shakespeare, from a musical, whatever it be, but not have to change a word, because actually, these, or race swap a character, or whatever it might be, because sort of, I think sometimes, normally actually if they're not protagonists, if they're sort of small enough supporting roles, sometimes that doesn't make any difference. Sometimes there's enough there that you go, oh, this is an interesting thing. I think actually generally, with Chalk Circle, you have to wade in and fuck around with the text in order to make that work, because otherwise actually you are still pushing othered and sort of minority identities into this cishet framework and going it's all the same if you don't look too hard. I had, I think, like a little bit of an issue maybe with the Constellations, the Nick Payne play in the West End revival a few years ago, which is a brilliant play by a great writer and a really classy production. But of these sort of like multiple couples of going like, here's your, if you like, quote unquote, here's the normal one, here's the white cishet couple, and then we've got the black couple, and then we've got the older couple, and then we've got the queer couple, and of going, but you know, if you see that original production, which again was incredible, at the Royal Court with Rose Swall and Sally Hawkins, going, those characters are written as a very, very specific type of, I think, like 30-something cis-het metropolitan middle class couple, and how they behave is codified in such a manner. And then to sort of squish another identity into that, I feel like actually for me isn't doing justice to that identity, because queerness does make a difference to the way in which you exist in the world, in the same way that race does, or that disability does, or that anything else sort of might. So actually I am all for smart queering of existing text, particularly existing stories where you can riff on a frame, where you can go, I'm going to rewrite this myth, this iconic thing, this sort of existing tale in a way. But I think when you're sort of going, I can just take this boilerplate script off the shelf, recast it, sometimes you run into difficulties. But so alongside that sort of reclaiming of stories, I would like to get to a point where we can just have mainstream queer storylines where that's a facet of life, and it is something that has an impact in the way in which this character moves through the world, but it isn't the one thing that defines them. I feel like that should sort of be the end goal of representation for me. Yeah.
I mean, I like the, as you said, like if you're queering a character but not kind of taking care with it, being in this industry and being a creative and being an actor and being part of this kind of community, one of the beautiful things about this world is how, I hate this word, but diverse and eclectic, and all these different personalities and lived experiences and people it attracts. And by just not giving them the chance, and not giving the writer the chance or the director the chance to really put themselves into it, which I think is, I mean, it's the point of me as an actor, is to try and tell the truth. So if I'm not allowed to use my whole truth, there is always going to be something that's not quite, I mean, it's not fully taking shape in a way that I think it can. It's amazing. Like, there's a really, I don't know if it was Chalk Circle, it might have been. There was just a line in it because who knows if I'm going to be in it, and it said hands, and I had to say like, take my hands. And it took me ages to build up the confidence to go, hi, Chris Bush, could I say hand? Because I have one. And I just think it takes me out of the character, because you were like, yeah, of course. And I think if there were more people just with that in mind and going, oh, does that not sit well in your brain, in your mouth? Like, it doesn't really sound like something you might say. So let's just change it a little bit. And the more that we can do that, and it's like, it links to being queer as well, the more that you can go, actually, this is the way that I would say this, or it just makes it feel kind of more authentic. And I think as people in the creative industry, we can see it, but for an audience who, you know, it might be their first time ever seeing a play, I think you can feel when something is real and something feels right for that person. And yeah, I think that would be an amazing place to get to if, with these stories and with these characters and these people, if we could kind of give it more to the real person in that community. And yeah, I think that would be an exciting kind of flip.
I think that is so exciting. And actually, when I'm talking to people on these episodes, that's the thing that makes me most excited, when people say, actually, as an actor, I was involved in developing this, and, you know, or as a director, I was able to do this. And that idea of, you know, multiple people being able to be involved in creating these characters. And, you know, and you're right, I think that is part of what makes authentic representation. Thank you very much, Chris and Beth, for joining us on the podcast today. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening at home, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Represent, the Queer Musical Theatre podcast. The research for this series is funded by the British Academy Early Career Researchers Network Seed Fund and supported by Sheffield Hallam University. The episodes were recorded at the Content is Queen podcast studios at the Makerversity at Somerset House. For more information, go to contentisqueen.org. In next week's episode, we continue exploring Standing at the Sky's Edge with actor and writer Lauren Redding, who played Nikki in the original West End cast at the Gillian Lynn Theatre. See you then.